Hello, welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also, consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Let me welcome our guest tonight, Ambassador Chas Freeman. Ambassador Freeman is a former U.S. diplomat, an author, and a critic of U.S. foreign policy. Ambassador Freeman, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Glad to be with you, Judge. Fine.
I wanted to focus on U.S. foreign policy, particularly vis-a-vis Russia and China today. We have discussed with you Russia before, but we haven't spent enough time on China. So maybe a good place to begin with is the recently published 2025 National Security Strategy document. It is explicit in restating a formula, let's say, that has been out there for a while, which includes cessation of hostility with Russia, saying that that's in the interest of the West, including Europe, not just in the United States, but elevating the escalation of Indo-Pacific, the target being primarily China. I'm curious how you read this strategy or the document.
Well, I don't think it's really a strategy. It's a collection of tactical, sometimes contradictory elements. But it is, in its effects, actually quite revolutionary. And it does, as you indicated, suggest that a principal objective of U.S. foreign policy in Eurasia is the normalization with Russia. It basically writes off the European alliances, and it transforms our European allies from allies whose interests require consideration and attending to auxiliaries whose only function is to support the United States in its global contest for influence with China. This is something that has left Europeans gasping. In effect, it invites Europe to do what ASEAN has done, and that is to fill a great power vacuum with its own power. But whether Europe is capable of that or not is very uncertain, given the divisions among Europeans, which are growing rather than diminishing. With respect to China, I noticed at the summit in Busan between Xi Jinping and Donald Trump that President Trump seemed to accept China as an equal, a peer, for the first time. And his demeanor suggested that he personally does not believe we can outcompete China or win a war with it. And therefore, the document, the National Security Strategy document that you referred to, basically redefines the US-China competition in economic terms. It's very vague about the military dimensions of this. Interestingly, for a national security document, doesn't refer to either Korea, both of which are rather explosive potentially in Northeast Asia. It doesn't deal with Taiwan in the usual manner. It appears to imply that the Taiwan issue will be managed not by direct military intervention if there is a war, but by a reaction overall in terms of American strength. And the most revolutionary aspect of it, of all, of course, and I want to make a comment about India before I conclude, but the most revolutionary aspect of all is the return to an exaggerated view of the Monroe Doctrine and an emphasis on a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, which contains great contradictions. On the one hand, there's no recognition of any sovereignty at all except that of the United States. And we're seeing American lawless behavior with regard to Venezuela and Colombia, and a bullying attitude generally. But at the same time, the document posits that we have the support of the countries who are bullying. I don't think this is a sustainable balance. Let me just finish by saying that it doesn't really do anything about India. In my view, it sort of mentions India, but I would say that the implication of it is far less interest in courting India, which has had the advantage of being a major swing state in global geopolitics. It basically, therefore, I guess, in a sense, recognizes what's happened. The United States, by doing what it's doing, it has done with both China and Russia, has pushed them together. This means that Russia, which was once anti-China in the late Soviet period, is now not available to India as a backer to the extent it would have been. So India's swing state position has been injured, not eliminated, but injured. And so this is a document, if I sum up, which has major geopolitical implications if, in fact, it is followed. But we don't know whether it will be followed or not, because I think a great deal of the U.S. military and the so-called deep state, to the extent it has survived the Trump depredations, is not in sympathy with this set of views, and nor are some parts of the American elite. Lawyers in particular, I think, find the might makes right atmosphere tone of this document unacceptable. So I think it raises great questions. It is, however, potentially a geopolitical earthquake.
I found it interesting in the document that it came across to me as a hybrid mismatch of the Trump ideologues and the deep state ideologues. So even talking about India, they are reiterating the deep state position that India would be among those allies to counter China. While on the other hand, they are redefining the Indo-Pacific in geoeconomic terms. So therein you get all these trade talks, trade wars containing China
Right.
economically, tariffing, etc., etc. But it is full of contradictions because the tariff guys, Peter Navarro, Miran, and others, they are basically extremely hawkish against India, driven by the agriculture lobby, etc., etc. So, in effect, the contradiction that you seem to indicate is very much there, apparent in the document.
Well, the document, as you say, is an amalgam of grudges and resentments, as well as lavish praise for the supreme leader, Donald Trump. That is something very new in such documents. In the past, they've been rather anodyne and objective. This one is a song of praise to the current administration and its leader, whose vision is, of course, very self-contradictory and also ephemeral. It changes from moment to moment. So, yes, that is a strange element of this, and I think this again goes back to the last doubt that I expressed, whether this in fact will be implemented. I think there's some real question on two levels about Donald Trump. One is his inconstancy. He's impulsive. He's peevish. He's petulant. He is not strategic. Not a strategic thinker. He's very tactical and transactional. And this is a very transactional document, not strategic. But the other doubt, so in other words, is he going to stick with this or not? And the second unknown is whether he's going to make it to the end of his term, because he's clearly deteriorating mentally and physically. You can see this, you can hear it in his remarks. He has difficulty completing whole thoughts or even complete sentences. So his psychological condition is not good, and it is getting worse, with quite a bit of evidence of senility setting in. So that means J.D. Vance may be the president. And the one thing we know about J.D. Vance is that he has nothing but contempt for Europe, and he embraces European right-wing causes. And this is built into the document. On the one hand, the United States is saying, leave us alone in the Western Hemisphere, which was the essence of the Monroe Doctrine, a century, two centuries ago. But on the other hand, it's saying we are going to interfere in European politics to boost the Alternative for Deutschland and Marine Le Pen and other, Viktor Orban and other people who do not share the EU neoconservative or liberal consensus. So I think, again, another contradiction. And it goes back to the point I made that this document essentially leaves no room for a transatlantic alliance. Because now there have been some comments. I noticed a comment by General Hodges, who said, condemning the document, that this basically leaves Europe in a Russian sphere of influence. I think that is absurd, actually. But it does go to the point I made, that Europeans are now being asked to fill the vacuum the American withdrawal is leaving. But that's nothing new. I mean, we've seen efforts made to boost European defense spending. The fact is, Europeans have, however, not risen to the challenge. They have no vision to deal with a world in which the West is no longer at the center. They have no vision to deal with the neutralization of Ukraine by Russia, which is nearing its completion, in my view. They have no vision of transatlantic relations other than sycophancy directed at Donald Trump, which is obviously a short-term expedient, not a strategy. So Europe is being challenged to do things that it may not have the capacity to do under the current weak leadership that it has. I mean, every leader in major countries of Europe is in difficulty with the electorate. There is a huge division between elites and mass in terms of attitudes on key issues like Ukraine or like defense spending. We saw this in the failure of Macron's effort to boost defense spending in France, and the objections in Germany to Merz's effort to do the same. And of course, Spain has quite a different posture than, with Spain being a very important country with global influence because of its role in the past in Latin America and its close relationship with North Africa. Spain and Germany have very, very different foreign policies. So can Europe pull itself together and do something? It is a geoeconomic superpower, but it doesn't exercise that power very skillfully. It is not a geopolitical superpower because it is so internally divided. Will it correct that? It's being put in a position where if it doesn't, it becomes irrelevant, and as I have called it, the sick man of Eurasia.
Yeah, in so many ways, the the difficulties for European dependency have become so much worse. I mean, on one hand, it continues to rely on the transatlantic financial architecture centered around New York. And it's not just London through the stock market and the money market, but it's also the larger European banking system. And so it is extremely having no alternative or vision to break away from this neoliberal financial architecture, which is a transatlantic architecture. It is extremely subservient to the American interest, the dollar system, New York, Wall Street, etc., etc. On the other hand, Europe is not as deindustrialized as the United States, but for structural reasons, for labor cost, etc., etc. The EU is also losing out to other players in the global south, China being primary. I mean, Germany is a prime example. In the beginning, Germany was exporting a lot to China, and so the Chinese rise had supported the German economy greatly because it was exporting machineries, plants, chemicals, etc. But now Chinese exports are eating up the German even domestic consumptions. So I'm not sure, given the lack of political imagination, given the lack of genuine parties that talk about people in Europe, I don't see an alternative in Europe.
Let me make a number of comments. First, the New York as the global financial center is a legacy of the Dutch. New York was New Amsterdam before it was New York, and the Dutch were, at the time of its establishment, by far the most sophisticated financial operators in the world, and that has carried on with a degree of sophistication in finance in New York that is really unmatched, even in London. I think that, however, may be coming to an end due to the irresponsibility of the American fiscal policies, the accumulation of mountains of debt, the reliance on credit rollovers rather than tax revenues to finance the government and its debt, the over-militarization of the US economy, which means it reduced productivity for the economy as a whole, since much of the military-industrial complex is, in fact, the equivalent of slothful state-owned industries, not effective, not competitive. So the financial system and the centrality of the United States to it is in some doubt. I don't think the United States will disappear as a factor in global finance, but it's pretty clearly going to be reduced in dominance of global finance. And the extent to which that will happen, we don't know. So that's the first point. The second point is that there is an obvious answer for Germany, which is to resume imports of cheap Russian energy. But Germany will not contemplate this, and therefore it is making itself uncompetitive with China and with everybody else. And the final point, which you implied but did not spell out, is illustrated by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's tracking of scientific and technological innovation. They tracked 64 categories. In 57 of them, China is now ahead of everyone else. There are 2 in which South Korea is ahead, and the United States is ahead in 5. Notice that Europe does not appear on that list. You can see coming down the road the possibility that India might join the leading group in some categories, not all, because Indian manufacturing remains rather weak. And manufacturing is absolutely key to technological innovation. You have to have both the laboratory and the factory working together, which is the secret of China's success. That and its investment in education, an educational system which is extremely demanding and and which winnows out the incompetent before they can do damage. All these things have essentially led to the eclipse of Europe, and by extension, the fear in the United States of American eclipse. As I said, I think Donald Trump, at least attitudinally, one doesn't know what goes on in his head because it's not clear that very much reasoning process is applied to problems. He seems to have an intuitive grasp of things rather than a methodical examination of them as his technique for dealing with the world. But at Busan, he appeared to evidence a conclusion that we could not outcompete China and therefore had to adjust our policies to live with it. He clearly sees the Taiwan issue as the Achilles heel of this relationship. And therefore, while he's not explicitly changed policy on it, he's clearly downplayed it as a center of American policy toward China, which of course disturbs our military, which have been directed for decades to make that the center of our policy. This is a world in which things are rearranging themselves, and you have to add to this, of course, the role of middle-ranking powers. This is why, as I've said before on your show, I don't like the phrase multipolar, because a pole is the end of a two-dimensional line. I think we're dealing with nodes, connectors of many relationships, and nodes are three-dimensional. They can turn, they can maneuver. So one day you can have a thick relationship between two nodes or three nodes in a network, or you can, and the next day, those can be attenuated. You can also, as in the case of China and the US, for example, have a hostile military relationship, but great economic interdependence, and a politically ambivalent relationship. I would hesitate to describe the US-Indian relationship at the moment, but it clearly also evidences nodal rather than polar behavior. And India, of course, I mentioned earlier in effect the downgrading of the Russian backing for India due to the Russian embrace of China, which Russia has been forced into by American policy. We have another little group emerging, very preposterous in its composition. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. I mean, there's nothing they have in common other than a distaste for American dictatorship. And sometimes India is part of this grouping, and sometimes it isn't. So I'm suggesting that we're entering a world order. It isn't a disorder, but it's a far more complex, kaleidoscopic order than we have been accustomed to. And it is in this context that the so-called global south, or perhaps the global majority, as Sergei Karaganov has characterized it, is becoming the central dynamic of global politics.
So multinodal probably would be a better choice of words or framework than multipolar.
In my view, yes, because, as I said, a node is a three-dimensional object that can connect multiple relationships, and many nodes can form a network, whereas poles don't form networks. So I think, I go back, I mentioned ASEAN. ASEAN is very impressive because it has essentially prevented the emergence of a vacuum in Southeast Asia. And while it lacks a certain amount of cohesion, it has filled that space very effectively. It's a major driver of global economics now, major trading factor. And it has it has an interesting combination of economic policies, from which I dare say India might learn a thing or two, um, given the perpetuation of the license raj and other um, phenomena that Prime Minister Modi said he wants to get rid of, but hasn't.
Yeah, what ASEAN has been able to do, trading or navigating between the US and China, Europe definitely has failed to do that between Russia and the US.
ASEAN has kept its distance. It's open to everybody in terms of dialogue. And this is a model that Europe might well emulate if it is to be cast out of the transatlantic alliance, as does appear to be the case. President Trump, in his first term, toward the end of it, attempted to withdraw U.S. forces from NATO. And ironically, of course, in his second term, he's increased the American military presence in Europe. No one should accuse him of consistency. And we have various, perhaps the biggest loss here, if you will, is the collapse of international law. So here's another failure of the Europeans. Ursula von der Leyen says the acquisition of territory by force is illegal and unacceptable. Well, how does she explain Kosovo vis-a-vis Serbia? How does she explain the European embrace of Israeli expansion and annexation of territory, which Europe does not oppose? She reserves her principle for one place, which is Ukraine. And of course, we have the odd phenomenon in Europe of Russophobia, which is primarily British in origin for two reasons. Well, of course, catalyzed and solidified by the Crimean War. But the basic British concern was that a Europe in which Russia played a major role would be one it could not manipulate. Europe and British over-the-horizon manipulation of Europe was central to British security concerns. And so Russophobia in Britain is alive and well, and it has contaminated the rest of Europe pretty thoroughly, overwhelming the German view, which always was that Europe needed an organic relationship with Russia. Now Germany takes the British view under Merz, even though Britain has left the European Union and no longer, now, of course, espouses Russophobia in part out of a desire to ingratiate itself with Washington, with the United States. Well, how is it going to manage when now that the United States no longer espouses Russophobia but wants a normalized relationship with Moscow? Interesting questions. I think we're entering a very interesting and unpredictable period of time.
It's also not just Germany taking the British view, but also the Nordic countries becoming more and more extreme in many cases.
This is odd because, of course, Finland was the model of a country that embraced Western culture entirely, epitomized it really in many ways, excelled in its Westernism, but at the same time was very careful to be deferential to Russia, to which it had sacrificed Karelia territory in the World War II period. So, or the run up to it. So I think Norway too, which has a long Arctic border with Russia, although it was part of NATO, always retained a bit of separation from the presence of American forces on its territory bases. These countries, Sweden, which had its own empire once and fought with the Russians in decisive battles. Sweden too has embraced the Russophobia that now characterizes European policy, and which is clearly a mental block to reconsideration of various issues of self-interest. I mentioned the issue of German access to cheap energy and resources from Russia, but that could be extended to everyone in Europe. So you have countries like Spain and Portugal, which have no particular antipathy to the Russians. Although Spain, of course, has a history of Russian intervention in its civil war. So this is very complicated, and Europe does seem to be determined to remain much less than the sum of its parts, which means it's impotent on the global level.
I want to come back to your comments on the Busan summit and also take that in combination with some of the things in the strategic security document. It, you were right in my reading that Donald Trump seems to be forced to accept that he has to live with this very powerful economic giant China, and at the moment he can't do much about it. I think that's a fair reading. Nevertheless, I also feel that in China's case, he seems to find himself in a situation similar to what he had found vis-a-vis Russia in his first administration, by which I mean that the national security document itself bears how much people like Albert Colby and others who wants to go into nuclear war wage on it, because it clearly talks at great length about, or in very pompous way, about the U.S. supremacy in nuclear war. It also, even if it doesn't mention Korea, it does talk about marshaling the allies from Japan through, up to the Philippines and into the first island chain. And so my reading of it was that it's less relevant what Trump himself thinks of when you look at the larger picture when it comes to U.S. foreign policy on China. Nothing has changed. It has remained extremely hawkish. You have written about U.S.-China relationship and failure in part of Washington in strategic imagination. So I wonder what your responses to my comments are.
Well, you're absolutely correct. Donald Trump does not have the agreement or support of the so-called deep state, of the neoconservatives who populate his administration. Marco Rubio, for example, is still under sanctions from China for having made vituperative remarks about it. China policy remains, except when Donald Trump intervenes, personally remains in the hands of China hawks, who are distinguished by their never having visited China, never having studied the place, not speaking the language, and yet their conviction that they know everything they need to know about China. So U.S. policy is driven by a priori reasoning rather than empiricism. And so all these things are true. And to describe the administration as schizophrenic or psychotic or some other psychiatric term would not be wrong. So we don't know what's going to happen. I think also the key to many things in what I call Pacific Asia, because I think the term Indo-Pacific is basically invented to coincide with the area of responsibility of the command in Honolulu. It doesn't exist. India does look east, but it is not part of the Pacific world to any great extent. So I call that Pacific Asia, as distinct from Indo-Pacific, which is a different concept related to the containment of China, um, or attempted containment of China, because it's not clear exactly what is being contained, other than the end of the Chinese Civil War, which divided Taiwan from the rest of China with American assistance. So I think the basic facts here are that we don't have a strategic policy toward China. We have multiple attitudes which don't add up to a strategy. And part of this is driven, part of what's happening is driven by two considerations. One, President Trump's relentless pursuit of adulation by others, especially powerful men like Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, Narendra Modi.
There has been some loss of love between the two recently, as per
Well, that
some.
is correct. No, dealing with a narcissistic, megalomaniacal narcissist is not easy. And all of these men are men of great vanity. I don't think Narendra Modi takes insults very easily either. And Trump clearly explodes when his self-image is punctured. So that's one point. The other is the rather absurd drive for a Nobel Peace Prize, which is the global stamp of approval, or at least it was until in the last decades it has been handed out like lollipops at a dentist's office. These are driving Trump's view. He's very eager to get to China in April. The fact that he set that date means that for the next 3 or 4 months, 4 or 5 months, since it's December, he's not going to do anything major to affront China. That, means that China has a measure of influence over and constraint on American action. Whether Xi Jinping will then reciprocate to visit Donald Trump or J.D. Vance or whoever is in charge later is another question. And I have not talked about the internal contradictions of the United States, which are increasingly apparent. I mean, here we have J.D. Vance, a Catholic convert, Christian nationalist, married to a Hindu. That says a great deal.
Extending Pacific Asia a little bit to include Latin America, or let me say, let me rephrase it. I wanted to ask you about the escalation on Venezuela at this moment, and
Sure.
a question that has been a lot of people has been asking is why Venezuela at this moment, and there are different explanations. Starting from ideological orientation of people like Rubio, the Cuban, the Florida lobby, or the Cuban lobby in Florida, to even talks about expanding economic ties between Latin America and China, and the nervousness about American corporations, about some of these key natural resources to be fallen in the hands of Chinese multinational corporations. I wonder what's your reading about why the U.S. is escalating on Venezuela at this moment.
Well, I think there are multiple forces driving this confrontation. One of which you mentioned, and that is the belief of Marco Rubio, who has influence within the administration on foreign policy, and particularly on policy in the American hemisphere, that if you can knock out Venezuela, Cuba will also fall. This is because after the Soviet Union cut its losses with Cuba, which I had something to do with helping them achieve, in the Angola-Namibia negotiations, where we removed the Cubans as a burden for the Soviet Union from Angola, and the Soviets then cut their supply of oil to Cuba. Venezuela made up the difference, but the Cuban intelligence services and the Venezuelan security services are intensely intertwined. And Venezuela's medical system, public health system, is dependent on the excellent Cuban doctors that.
So this is even before Chavez, the
Oh
intelligence.
yes, of course. Well, it's an eventual. It's developing. It's something that has developed over decades, and of course, the Cuban American voters in South Florida, of which Marco Rubio is part, have been infuriated by Venezuelan assistance to the Castro regime, and now to its successor. So this is a strategic consideration. But there's also, as you said, ideological opposition. The Cuban American community, for the most part, is bourgeois. It lost its property in Cuba. It's against any form of alleged socialism. So there's that. Venezuela is independent-minded. There has been an effort to overthrow its regime that's been going on now for over 2 decades. First against Hugo Chavez Frias, and now against Nicolas Maduro. And this has failed. But it has driven Venezuela to greater reliance on Russia, China, and other countries. So there's an unnatural oil trade now between Venezuela and China. And Venezuela is pretty far from China. That reflects this, because the Chinese have invested in Venezuela in return for oil supplies. So there's that. There's also the sense, ideologically, that the Bolivarian revolution, as Venezuela calls it, is a new form of anti-American revolution in Latin America, and therefore a challenge to the United States. There has been, as a result of American sanctions and, frankly, the incompetence of the Venezuelan government at running various things in Venezuela, there's been an outflow of about 8 million refugees from Venezuela. Most of them are in Latin America, but many are in the United States, where they too have a grudge against the Venezuelan government. Some of them are sufficiently lawless to cause a problem of law and order in the United States. And they are, of course, immigrants, and many of them illegal immigrants. And this has excited the remnants, the diminishing European American population, which, basically is reacting to a loss of power and influence, and has adopted a strong man in the form of Donald Trump, who says, you lost your power because your enemies took it away from you. And who are your enemies? They are immigrants from places other than Europe. So this is the current Trump ideology. So all these things come together, and we have the revival of, as I said, of a perverted version of the Monroe Doctrine, with Donald Trump trying to offset various things that are not going right in the United States under his administration, including affordability issues for consumers, by showing that he's really tough on drugs. And of course, this is the final pretext for the acts of piracy and the illegal boat murders that are being conducted by the U.S. Navy, primarily in the Caribbean, but also in the Pacific. And the irony here is that there's a very good historical record which demonstrates definitively that narcotics addiction problems can only be resolved by reducing demand. They cannot be resolved by curtailing supply. Why is that? Because, to put this close to, I know you're in India and Assam, on the other end of where a lot of opium used to be grown, but in the other end of India and Pakistan, there's Afghanistan. So a farmer in Afghanistan who grows poppy gets $1 for a piece of opium. That $1 is worth of opium is worth $300 on the streets of New York, and even more in Europe. So with this kind of markup and profitability, there is no way you can stop the supply. The demand will always be met by people who want to make a profit and who are quite ingenious at smuggling. This is also true of cocaine, which is the major product of northern South America. And it is true of fentanyl, which is manufactured in Mexico with components that are readily available on the international market and mostly come from China, because China has a huge petrochemical industry. And the components themselves are useful for all sorts of purposes, not just fentanyl. So you really can't deal with this but if you connect all this to China bashing, so much the better. So Venezuela is accused of smuggling fentanyl to the United States, which it doesn't do. Venezuela is the source of a small amount of cocaine smuggling, which goes from Venezuela to Trinidad, independent island nation off the Venezuelan coast, from which it goes to West Africa and Europe. It does not come to North America. So all of this is the usual pretext for the Trump administration to look tough. Interestingly, the intelligence community in the United States agrees entirely with the analysis I've just given you. That is, that the problem is demand, not supply, that the supply is not coming from Venezuela, and that therefore this is all unjustified, even in pragmatic terms. Of course, it is clearly illegal. You cannot murder people with no due process. It is an act of war, which, the United States has gone to war historically. When this has been done to American citizens, the Venezuelans would be entirely entitled to do the same. But of course, they're much smarter than that. They don't want to take on the United States. And Nicolas Maduro does not want to add to the problems that he already has. So he's open to some kind of compromise. And the Trump administration, however, has stepped out so far on the limb that if it is forced to saw off the limb, it will fall a long way reputationally. So this is, anyway, you asked about Venezuela. It's a very complicated question. I don't think you can attribute what is happening to any single cause. It's a congeries of causes, none of them really justifying what's being done.
We'll leave it there, Ambassador Freeman. As always, this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Judishman. Keep up the good work.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.